To continue our discussion of market sensing, moving from environmental analysis to the topic of research and consumer behavior. Specifically, we'll be discussing consumer behavior and as part of that, the purchase decision process and problem-solving behavior topics of consumer behavior. Let's start by defining what we mean by consumer behavior. There we're talking about the actions a buyer takes in purchasing a product, using a product, and disposing of the product. So when we're talking about consumer behavior, we're talking about all the actions before, after, and during product use. I want to show you a couple illustrations of consumer behavior. Let's look at how the differences in how men and women view or purchase greeting cards by looking at this Budweiser commercial.
Truly are like true love. Our love shines like a beacon. It's perfect.
So I think that particular YouTube video illustrates perfectly the differences between most men and women when they're buying a greeting card like a Valentine's Day card or something like that. So those describe consumer behavior from the perspective there we saw what they did before and during product use. Let's look at how marketers have changed tuna salad based upon the study of consumer behavior. Let's look here at Star-Kissed tuna. And if we look at one of the reasons people don't eat more tuna on the go or to take it to lunch, it probably deals a lot with the smell and everything you have to take with you to eat tuna at work. So to handle this problem for consumers, note that their package includes ready-made tuna salad. So you don't even have to mix the tuna with the mayonnaise and the relish anymore. It's already made for you. There are 6 crackers, a serving spoon to put the tuna on the crackers, a napkin, a mint afterwards so that you don't have bad breath. I would challenge you to see what's missing, what still don't they understand about why more people don't eat tuna for lunch. What happens after they eat this tuna packet? Do they have to dispose of the product? And when they do dispose of the product, is there a problem that's not solved? Do they put it in a trash can and you still continue to get that tuna smell? I would like to suggest that a way to better meet consumer need and to better understand consumer behavior would be to include perhaps a Ziploc type of bag in the packet so that would be easy to dispose of everything when you are done. So how do people go about buying, using, and consuming products? What I'd like to introduce now is the consumer decision-making process. And people who don't understand marketing tend to focus on how can we get people to buy. And while that's the long-term goal of marketers realize that individual consumers go through a process where before they can buy or purchase, they first have to recognize that they have a problem or a need. We would define that as the difference between what they actually have and what they desire. And so when a person has a difference between what they have and what they desire, they then recognize that they have a problem or a need and will begin to search for alternatives to help them solve that problem. So we define problem recognition as the difference between actual and desired, information search then is when they would look to some internal sources, basically what they might remember about different ways to solve this problem or different brands. But they also would look to some external sources, like personal sources being their friends, their family, their coworkers. They might also look to public sources, things that they see in news publications or consumer reports or on social media by people who aren't necessarily their friends or family or are not the marketer of the products or services. And they also use many external sources that are developed by the marketers. Advertisements, web page, selling, personal salespeople, all of those serve as external sources. So I'd like to ask you right now, what external source do you think people trust the least? Personal sources, their friends and family; public sources, things they might see in the media that are not paid advertising or promotion; or marketer sources, information about the product from the marketer. They probably trust marketer sources the least and personal sources the most. That's why it's so important for marketers to have satisfied customers so that the word of mouth generated by personal sources is more positive and makes a great influence on people. So again, we're talking about when consumers make a decision to buy, the first thing they have to do is recognize they have a need or a problem. They then use internal and external sources to search for information. They then begin to evaluate various alternatives. And when they evaluate alternatives, one of the things they'll do is in their mind or perhaps even on paper come up with some of the evaluative criteria that they would use. Keep in mind, these evaluative criteria may not all have equal weight. For example, perhaps the most important thing to someone choosing a college is price and class size. To another person, the most important criteria might be majors offered and location. Regardless, consumers have some sort of evaluative criteria that they use when they are evaluating the different brands in their consideration set. The consideration set would be the list of acceptable brands that they would consider. So if it's a very important purchase, a consumer might actually put down a pro and con list or do a little chart. But if it's not a very important purchase or a purchase in which they have a high level of involvement, they may simply quickly do this in their head. For example, you can see how this consumer thinks about brand A, B, and C. And it might be that in this case, because what is most important is price and class size, they would choose brand A. So this explains how consumers go about evaluating alternatives. So again, as we talk about the consumer problem-solving process, we've talked about problem recognition, information search, evaluation of alternatives, and then purchase. By the way, not all the time when we go through this process do we end up purchasing. It might be that we go through this process and say, what I have is adequate. I don't need to purchase a new car, or I don't need to go back to college. But at some point, if they do decide to purchase, they will select an outlet, and a number of factors can have huge influence here. For example, the type of financing, delivery, or just plain availability of the product might make them to choose another alternative that they hadn't selected. Oftentimes, after a person purchases, they experience what is called post-purchase dissatisfaction or satisfaction. And if it's dissatisfaction, we call that cognitive dissonance or buyer's remorse. When we say cognitive, it means thinking. And when we say dissonance, it means unbalanced. So if you have unbalanced thinking about a purchase, you question whether or not you made the right decision. Something I'd like to point out right here is that all of a marketer's efforts are not necessarily directed just at problem recognition, information search, evaluation of alternatives, and purchase. Many times, seeing an advertisement or promotion about something that you've recently purchased helps you to eliminate cognitive dissonance and, in your mind, solidify that you did make a good purchase. One thing I want to emphasize is that you don't go through this process with the same level of intensity or concern for all products you buy. In other words, depending upon your level of involvement with a particular product or product category, you might go through this process very, very quickly. In doing so, you would use what's called routine problem-solving behavior. So typically when you want to buy a bottle of ketchup, you don't spend much time going through this process. And in fact, you probably don't do any post-purchase evaluation unless the product doesn't perform as expected. If this product that you're buying is very important to you and you have a high level of involvement, either because it's very expensive or there's a lot of risk involved or it's going to reflect significantly on your personal image, you might take a lot of time going through this process. And in that case, you would be using what's called extended problem solving. A girl buying her wedding dress or her prom dress probably uses extended problem solving. Very rarely would they buy the first one they tried on, even if they liked it best, without first trying other alternatives. And then products that are purchased with some level of involvement or some investigation of these different levels would use what is called limited problem solving. So if you were going to buy a new blender, for example, or a new outfit or something like that, you would probably use limited problem solving. So I just wanted to illustrate here for you the beginning of the concept consumer behavior and the consumer buying decision.